For more than a century, one question has haunted the field of biblical archaeology more than almost any other. Did the United Kingdom of David and Solomon, as described in the Hebrew Bible, actually exist as a real, urbanized, centrally organized state? Or was it a much later literary invention, a national myth retroactively projected onto a modest hill country chiefdom that never had the population, the infrastructure, or the political reach the biblical text assigns to it? This is not an idle academic squabble. It is one of the most consequential disputes in the entire discipline, because the answer determines how we read some of the most influential texts in human history, and because for decades, the physical evidence on the ground seemed to support the skeptics. Then, in 2007, a low, unremarkable hilltop overlooking the Elah Valley in Israel's Judean Shephelah started giving up a very different story, and archaeologists have been arguing about what it means ever since. The hill is called Khirbet Qeiyafa. What came out of it did not end the argument. If anything, it made the argument sharper, more technical, and more consequential than it had ever been before, and it is still generating new publications, new counter-publications, and new points of genuine disagreement nearly 2 decades later. The Elah Valley is not an obscure location. It is, according to biblical tradition, the very valley where David fought Goliath, a strategic corridor connecting the coastal Philistine plain to the highlands of Judah, the kind of terrain that any ancient power wanting to control access to Jerusalem would need to defend. Despite its significance, the low mound at Khirbet Qeiyafa had never been seriously excavated. It looked, to most surveyors who had passed it over the decades, like just another undistinguished pile of stones from an uncertain period, the kind of site that gets a single line in a regional survey report and is then quietly forgotten. That changed when Yosef Garfinkel of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Sar Ganor of the Israel Antiquities Authority began systematic excavations at the site in 2007, work that would continue through 2011 under the auspices of both institutions and would later expand into further study seasons that produced a multi-volume final excavation report running into the 2010s. What they found in the very first seasons was not what anyone expected from a minor rural outpost. It was a fortified city, a real one, with real urban planning sitting at exactly the period and exactly the location where the biblical narrative places the emergence of an early Judahite kingdom. The site is protected by a massive casemate wall, a double-walled fortification technique with chambers built into the wall itself, of a scale and sophistication that surprised excavators given how briefly the settlement seems to have existed, probably no more than a few decades, based on the stratigraphy. Most strikingly, the city has not one but 2 monumental gateways, an architectural feature so unusual for a site of this size and period that Garfinkel and Ganner eventually proposed identifying the ruins with Sha'arayim, a place name mentioned in the Hebrew Bible that literally translates to 2 gates, and which appears in the biblical text in direct connection with the very narrative of David's battle against the Philistines in this same valley. That single detail, a settlement with 2 gates, matching a place named 2 gates in a text written about the exact region and exact era in question, is the kind of correspondence that either means something or means nothing, and archaeologists have spent the better part of 2 decades arguing about which. It is worth noting that no other Iron Age site in the entire southern Levant has yet produced 2 monumental gates in a single fortification circuit, which is precisely why the identification, however contested its political implications remain, has proven difficult for skeptics to simply wave away on architectural grounds alone. The find that first pulled Khirbet Qeiyafa out of academic obscurity and into international news coverage came not from the walls or the gates, but from something much smaller, a broken piece of pottery covered in ink. In the site's second excavation season, archaeologists recovered an inscribed ostracon, a potsherd used as a writing surface, a common and economical practice in the ancient world before papyrus or parchment were widely available for everyday use. The moment the ostracon was identified as bearing writing, and identified as coming from a securely dated 10th century BCE stratum, it became one of the most scrutinized objects in the entire field of biblical archaeology. If the inscription could be reliably read and reliably dated, it would represent one of the earliest known Hebrew or Proto-Hebrew texts ever discovered, physical evidence that some form of organized, literate administration existed in the Judean hill country far earlier than many scholars had believed possible. The ostracon was published in its first official form, what specialists call the Editio Princeps, the initial scholarly publication establishing the baseline reading, by the excavation's own epigraphist Haggai Misgav, working together with Garfinkel and Ganner in the 2009 excavation volume. Their proposed reading was cautious. They identified a handful of legible words and letter clusters, but stopped short of offering a full connected translation, noting only that certain vocabulary appeared to support an early Hebrew identification for the script. That caution did not last long once other specialists got involved. Ada Yardeni, one of the most respected paleographers working on ancient Semitic scripts, contributed her own independent analysis in the same excavation volume, proposing slightly different letter readings at several contested points, but likewise declining to commit to a full translation. Then, in a lengthy 2009 article, Gershon Galil of the University of Haifa went considerably further, proposing an expansive and fully connected translation of all 5 lines, arguing that 8 of the roughly 18 legible words on the Ostracon are attested exclusively in Biblical Hebrew and nowhere else in the surrounding Semitic language family, a claim that, if correct, would be a striking argument for classifying the text as Hebrew specifically rather than a more generic regional Canaanite dialect. On the strength of that claim, the University of Haifa issued a public press release in January 2010 announcing that the inscription had effectively been deciphered and that it contained an early social and legal statement concerning the protection of the vulnerable, language about judging the case of the widow and the orphan, pleading for the poor, and restraining the powerful from oppressing those beneath them. The French epigrapher Émile Puech of the École Biblique in Jerusalem produced yet another independent reading, differing from Galil's at several key letters but converging on a broadly similar thematic conclusion, that the text concerns royal or social obligations toward the weak, possibly connected thematically to the kind of royal duties described in the biblical account of Saul's kingship. Other scholars were considerably less convinced that any coherent sentence-level translation was recoverable at all. Some, including specialists working independently of the original excavation team, have argued the Ostracon may preserve nothing more than a list of personal names, a mundane, administrative record rather than a moral or legal proclamation, pointing to the fact that several of the disputed words correspond equally well to known personal names attested elsewhere in the ancient Near East, as they do to the abstract nouns Galil and Puech prefer. The disagreements are not stylistic quibbles. They begin at the level of individual letter forms. In the second line of the inscription, for example, specialists agree the first legible cluster of letters can be read as the Hebrew root for judge, but disagree on almost everything that follows it, whether a particular faint mark represents one letter or another, whether an abraded and barely visible sign should be read as the letter that would complete the word for widow, and whether a name is actually present in the line at all. Christopher Rolston, an epigrapher who has published prominently on Northwest Semitic scripts, urged particular methodological caution about drawing large historical conclusions from a text this damaged and this contested, prompting a direct published exchange between Rolston and Garfinkel over how much interpretive weight the Ostracon could actually bear. An exchange that itself became part of the site's now substantial secondary literature. What is not in dispute is the physical object itself and its stratigraphic context. A genuine, securely dated, 5-line inked inscription. From the very beginning of the 10th century BCE, recovered under controlled excavation conditions rather than purchased on the antiquities market or reported without provenance, which is precisely the kind of evidentiary pedigree that gives even an unresolved translation real scholarly weight. That combination, real archaeological context, genuinely disputed content, is rarer in this field than either fully agreed upon inscriptions or fully discredited ones, and it is a large part of why Khirbet Qeiyafa continues to generate publications years after the last excavation season closed. The Ostracon was not the only piece of writing to emerge from the site, and the second discovery, though it attracted less popular press attention, may ultimately prove more significant to specialists in onomastics, the study of personal names. During later study of pottery recovered from the excavation, Garfinkel, along with epigraphers Mitka Golub and Haggai Misgav, and co-excavator Sar Ganner, identified a short inscription on a large storage jar reading what they interpreted as the personal name Ishbal, son of Beda. The name Ishbal, meaning roughly man of Baal, using the divine name Baal in its literal sense as a word for Lord, rather than as an idolatrous invocation, is significant because it corresponds closely to a name pattern known from the Bible, most notably Ishbal, rendered in some biblical manuscript traditions as Ishbosheth, a son of King Saul. The inscription represents, according to the excavators, the earliest known attestation of this particular Hebrew name pattern found in a controlled archaeological context, and adds another, small but genuine data point to the broader argument that a distinct naming tradition, later reflected in the biblical text, was already in use in the region during the very century in question. As with the Ostracon, this inscription has generated its own smaller round of scholarly back and forth over letter forms and readings, including later reanalyses proposing alternative letter identifications at a few contested points. But the broad outline of the find, a genuine Iron Age inscription bearing a name with direct and specific resonance in the biblical narrative, has held up as one more small thread in an accumulating pattern that Khirbet Qeiyafa's excavators argue points toward organized, literate, name-bearing communities in Judah earlier than the skeptical model allows. To understand why Khirbet Qeiyafa became a genuine flashpoint rather than just another interesting dig, you have to understand the larger and much older argument it walked directly into, a debate that stretches back to the earliest days of modern biblical archaeology. In the mid-20th century, the dominant figures in the field, scholars like William Foxwell Albright and later Yigael Yadin, generally worked from an assumption that the biblical narrative of a powerful, unified Israelite monarchy under David and Solomon was broadly historical, and they interpreted the archaeological evidence at sites like Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer accordingly, identifying monumental six-chambered gate structures at all three sites as products of a centralized Solomonic building program described in the biblical text. This was, for decades, close to a scholarly consensus. That consensus began to erode seriously starting in the 1990s, driven above all by Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, who argued for what became known as the low chronology, the position that the archaeological strata traditionally attributed to the era of David and Solomon actually belonged to a somewhat later period, roughly a century on from where Albright and Yadin had placed them, and that the 10th century BCE itself, the era the Bible assigns to a powerful, unified Israelite kingdom, shows no material evidence of the kind of centralized state. Monumental architecture or administrative sophistication the biblical text describes. Under this view, the united monarchy of David and Solomon was largely a later literary and theological construction, composed centuries afterward and retrojected onto a much smaller, poorer, and more fragmented Iron Age reality, a highland chiefdom rather than a kingdom, more comparable in scale to a tribal confederation than to the empire described in the books of Samuel and Kings. This low chronology argument reshaped an entire generation of biblical archaeology and pushed the field's center of gravity firmly towards skepticism about the historical united monarchy, which is precisely the intellectual landscape that Khirbet Qeiyafa's excavation dropped into in 2007. Garfinkel's excavation team took direct aim at the low chronology using the most rigorous tool available: radiocarbon dating of short-lived organic material. In the destruction layer of the city, excavators recovered burnt olive pits sealed inside storage jars, exactly the kind of short-lived, single-season organic sample that gives radiocarbon analysis its highest precision, since an olive pit reflects the year it grew rather than decades of accumulated older wood, the way a structural timber beam might. 17 of these olive pit samples were sent out for accelerator mass spectrometry dating, split between two independent laboratories in Oxford and Belfast specifically to guard against any single lab's systematic bias, part of what became two separate published dating projects rather than a single one-off result. The results converged on a strikingly narrow window. The destruction of the city occurred in the very first part of the 10th century BCE, somewhere in the range of roughly 1000 to 970 BCE. That is not a vague wiggle room date. That is a radiocarbon-anchored destruction event landing squarely inside the traditional chronology for the early Israelite monarchy. Squarely inside, in other words, the exact period the low chronology camp had spent nearly 2 decades arguing the archaeological record couldn't actually support. Garfinkel has been direct in framing the site's significance around exactly this point: a fortified, centrally planned urban settlement, protected by monumental defensive architecture, with a genuine short-lived occupation destroyed in a single violent event, existing in Judah at precisely the century the biblical text assigns to David, is very difficult to reconcile with a model in which no organized state existed there yet. In Garfinkel's own framing, echoed in several publications co-authored with Hebrew, University radiocarbon specialist Katharina Streit, and with Michael Hazel of Southern Adventist University, Khirbet Qeiyafa was never meant to prove every detail of the biblical narrative, but it was meant, quite deliberately, to test one very specific and very falsifiable claim. Could a state-level urban fortified society have existed in Judah in the early 10th century BCE at all? Their answer, based on the radiocarbon evidence, was yes. If the story ended there, it would be a tidy vindication. It does not end there, because Finkelstein and other scholars did not simply concede the point, and their counter-arguments are substantive and technical rather than reflexive dismissal. One line of pushback challenges the ethnic and political identification of the site rather than its date. Scholars including Nadav Naaman and Ido Koch have argued that the material culture at Khirbet Qeiyafa, the pottery styles, the broader domestic and cultic assemblage, shows strong affinities with nearby Canaanite sites such as Beit Shemesh, and that identifying the settlement's population as specifically Judahite, in the sense of belonging to a Jerusalem-centered kingdom, may be reading a later ethnic and political label backward onto an earlier and more ambiguous reality that likely had far more fluid and overlapping cultural boundaries than a simple Israelite versus Canaanite binary suggests. Finkelstein, together with Alexander van Talken, has gone further, arguing that if the site has any political affiliation with a larger polity at all, Its architectural and cultural connections may point northward toward the highlands, rather than specifically toward Jerusalem, and that nothing about the 10th century evidence establishes Jerusalem, Hebron, or Caiapha as the coordinated administrative core of a unified Judahite state stretching across the region. A separate and more technical dispute concerns pottery chronology directly. Archaeologist Lily Singer-Avitz published a detailed reassessment of the site's ceramic assemblage, arguing for a somewhat different relative dating than the excavators proposed, a critique that Garfinkel and his colleagues responded to directly in subsequent published rebuttals. Another example of the kind of granular, evidence-based back and forth that characterizes the entire Caiapha literature far more than it resembles the broad rhetorical battles that dominate popular coverage of biblical archaeology. In other words, the argument at Khirbet Caiapha was never really, did a city exist? The walls and the gates settle that question on their own, and even the skeptics do not dispute the radiocarbon dates themselves. The argument is about what the people who built it called themselves, who they answered to, whether their material culture reflects a distinct emerging Judahite identity or a more generic regional Canaanite-Israelite continuum, and whether the modest but genuine urban planning on that hilltop is evidence of David's kingdom specifically, or evidence of a more anonymous and more politically fragmented Iron Age landscape that the biblical authors later folded into a single, grander national narrative centuries after the fact. This is again worth pausing on. It is a live, technical, peer-reviewed dispute between named scholars working from published data, not a case of fringe enthusiasts being dismissed by an unwilling establishment. Both sides have radiocarbon dates. Both sides have pottery typologies. Both sides have made their case in the same academic journals and the same edited volumes, including, notably, a 2016 collection literally titled Debating Khirbet Caiapha, a fortified city in Judah from the time of King David, produced by the site's own excavators, specifically to lay out and respond point by point to the counter-arguments raised over the preceding decade. Beyond the ostracon and the radiocarbon dates, Khirbet Caiapha produced a third category of evidence that has generated its own smaller but genuinely fascinating scholarly argument. A cluster of decorated architectural models, small clay and stone objects shaped like miniature buildings, recovered from cultic and domestic contexts within the site. Garfinkel and architectural historian Madeleine Mumkwoglu have argued in a series of publications, culminating in a dedicated study of Solomon's temple and palace, that decorative features on these models, specifically a pattern of recessed stepped door frames and a set of triglyph-like carved elements along their facades, correspond directly to two specific architectural terms used in the biblical description of Solomon's temple and palace complex, terms whose precise physical meaning had previously been genuinely uncertain to biblical scholars and translators working from the text alone, with no comparable physical object to check their interpretations against. If the correspondence holds, it would mean these small 10th century clay and stone objects are effectively a physical dictionary entry for architectural vocabulary that has otherwise survived only as words on a page, disconnected from any known physical referent for nearly 3,000 years. This claim, like the others, has not been universally embraced. It depends on a chain of interpretive judgments about which decorative details on a small clay model correspond to which specific words in a much later redacted biblical text. And reasonable scholars disagree about how tight that correspondence really is, and about how much weight a small portable cult object recovered from a modest provincial hill fort can really bear when compared against the description of a royal temple complex in Jerusalem that has left no surviving physical remains of its own to compare against directly. But it is, again, a claim built from an actual excavated object rather than an aerial photograph or an anecdote, which is precisely what makes Khirbet Caiapha different from so much of the material that circulates under the broader banner of biblical archaeology. The site also produced a broader assemblage of cultic material, including cultic standing stones or massaboth, and shrine models found in domestic scale contexts rather than in any single dedicated temple structure, that Garfinkel and his colleagues have argued reflects a form of religious practice notably lacking in the kind of figurative human and animal imagery common at contemporary Canaanite and Philistine sites, a pattern they suggest is consistent with the aniconic religious tendencies later associated with Israelite worship. This argument, too, remains contested, since the sample size involved is modest, and the interpretive leap from absence of figurines to specifically Israelite religious identity is one that other scholars regard as considerably less secure than the radiocarbon dates underpinning the site's basic chronology. It's worth being explicit about why Khirbet Caiapha occupies a different category of credibility than most sensational biblical discovery stories that circulate online. This isn't a single controversial photograph, a lone independent researcher operating outside institutional oversight, or a claim that surfaces once and is never subjected to follow-up analysis. It is a fully published excavation conducted over 5 continuous seasons by a university-affiliated team working under the Israel Antiquities Authority, with results appearing across a multi-volume excavation report and dozens of peer-reviewed articles, subjected to 2 independent radiocarbon dating projects at 2 separate laboratories, and argued over in direct, named published exchanges with the very scholars most skeptical of traditional biblical chronology. Finkelstein, foremost among them, but also Naumann, Koch, Van Talken, Singer-Avitz, and Rolston, each engaging with specific, citable pieces of the evidence rather than dismissing the site wholesale. That is precisely what makes the unresolved parts of the story more interesting rather than less. Nobody credible disputes that a fortified, short-lived, radiocarbon-dated 10th century city sat on that hill. What remains genuinely open is what to call its inhabitants, what political structure they answered to, how to read 5 faded lines of ink on a broken pot, and how much interpretive weight a handful of decorated clay building models can bear. Questions serious enough that the field's leading skeptic and the site's own excavators have been, debating them face to face in print for over a decade, without either side backing down and without the debate ever collapsing into the kind of unfalsifiable, evidence-free argument that characterizes so much popular biblical archaeology content. Excavation work in the broader Elah Valley region, including at the nearby and even larger site of Tel Lachish, has continued to refine the picture of what Iron Age Judah actually looked like on the ground, adding new stratigraphy and new radiocarbon, sequences to a chronology debate that shows no sign of concluding neatly. Some scholars have also pointed to a separate and independently significant piece of evidence from a different site entirely, the Tel Dan Stele, a fragmentary basalt inscription discovered in northern Israel in the 1990s, bearing what many epigraphers read as a reference to the House of David, which, if the reading is correct, would represent the earliest known extra-biblical reference to David as the founder of a royal dynasty. That inscription has its own separate history of scholarly dispute over the reading of a few damaged letters, but it is frequently discussed alongside Khirbet Qeiyafa as part of the broader accumulating case that a historical David, whatever the true scale of his kingdom, left some trace in the material and epigraphic record beyond the biblical text alone. Garfinkel and his colleagues have continued to publish in defense of the high chronology and the Sha'arayim identification. Finkelstein and allied scholars have continued to publish rebuttals grounded in ceramic typology, regional comparison, and alternative readings of the site's ethnic affiliation. Neither side has produced a single knockout piece of evidence that has ended the argument, and neither side appears to expect one. The debate has instead matured into a genuinely productive, decade-spanning scholarly conversation with real stakes and real data on both sides, which is a considerably rarer outcome in this field than either total consensus or total stalemate. What almost nobody in the field disputes anymore is the basic fact that startled everyone back in 2007. Something organized, fortified, and administratively capable existed in the Judean hill country at the start of the 10th century BCE, considerably earlier and considerably more substantial than the prevailing skeptical model had allowed. Whether that something was David's kingdom in the specific sense the Bible describes, or a more modest and more anonymous Iron Age polity that later national memory absorbed into a grander story, is a question the walls, the gates, the olive pits, the ostracon, and the inscribed jar have not yet fully answered, and may never answer on their own, no matter how many more seasons of study and reanalysis the site's rich and still-growing body of evidence eventually receives. That, in the end, is probably the most honest thing that can be said about Khirbet Qeiyafa. It didn't prove the Bible, it didn't disprove it either. What it did was force 2 generations of serious, credentialed, thoroughly institutional archaeologists into one of the most detailed and best documented arguments in the entire field, over a hill that almost nobody thought was worth digging into at all, and that nobody, on either side of the argument, has stopped digging into since.